Welcome everyone. Thanks a lot for staying with us. You're watching Plain Speak with me, Shivani Gupta. Prime Minister Narendra Modi today took the divisive forces within the country head-on at the Chintan Shivir of state home ministers and polices and asserted that Naxalism in all its forms has to be eliminated to strengthen internal security of the country. The Prime Minister warned the nation about all forms of Naxalism, including intellectual Naxals who hold the pen and try to mislead the younger generation. While the PM this time didn't explicitly use the term urban Naxals, the threat he outlined is very much in the same sphere, something he has talked about openly in the past, including on the floor of the parliament. You don't always have to be holding a gun to carry out the Naxal agenda. That's the central idea. And while India is defeating and shrinking the Red Terror footprint, is the intellectual threat still the biggest challenge? This threat of intellectual Naxalism has been talked about, exposed, debated in the past. With the Prime Minister highlighting it again today, the question we ask is, how prepared is India to fight? We will take this to our guests in just a bit, but first let me highlight what the Prime Minister said today. He began by saying that India needs to defeat all forms of Naxalism. That Naxals can be holding guns and also holding pens. He added, intellectual Naxals are trying to mislead the youth of the country. That pen-wielding Naxals, or those who are not really Naxals on the ground fighting with guns, are increasing their intellectual sphere. And therefore, since he was talking on the security aspect, Indian security forces also need to combat this in a greater fashion. Prime Minister highlighted this needs to be done smartly too. Importantly, the Prime Minister mentioned that emotive issues are blown out of proportion by certain sections to divide society, create fissures in the social fabric of the country, create unrest, instability. And finally, he added that some of the things being promoted by intellectual Naxals or Naxalism is so warped, they can pervert the minds of the future generations. This is not the first time the Prime Minister has directly taken on this threat of what has come to be known as urban Naxals. In fact, in the past, he has taken on the Congress party for promoting these concepts. For example, in February 2022, in Parliament, the Prime Minister accused the Congress of being the leader of Tukde Tukde gang, another slang used for breaking India anti-national forces within us. Also, February 2022, on the same occasion, replying to the debate on the motion of thanks to the President for his address to Parliament earlier this year, Prime Minister had also gone on to say that the Congress thinking seems to be hijacked by, quote, urban Naxals. In September this year, he said urban Naxals and anti-development elements stalled Sardar Sarovar Dam construction for years. This is a charge, of course, that Gujarat government, helmed by the BJP, has made for several years. October 2022, he said that Gujarat will not allow, quote, urban Naxals to destroy life of state's youth. So not the first time the Prime Minister is mentioning this. News18.com has also accessed a 21-page document published allegedly for circulation within the CPI Maoist in August this year as a prelude to observing the 18th anniversary of the formation of the party. This document gives a sense of its objectives and so-called achievements, especially the penetration within various mass organizations it calls the United Front, and leading of various agitations that have often been projected as spontaneous or helmed by a certain rightful agitated group. This gives us a sense of the dangers of such intellectual Naxalism. In this document, banned ultra-left outfit claims that it was part of the agitation against the farm laws. Now, why would Naxals or Maoist think tanks need to be part of anti-farm laws? It also names violent protests post the Agnipath scheme announcement as one of its successes. We all know what happened after that. In fact, it goes on to say the party not only extended support but also made efforts to lead them. By them, it means such protests and agitations. Now, the term urban Naxals may have come into vogue only recently, especially in the last 5 years, but the concept or the strategy or the modus operandi has been revealed much earlier. Let's take a look at that. In CPIM, which is the CPI Maoist 2007 document called Handbook on Strategy and Tactics of the Indian Revolution, the outfit outlines the blueprint to overthrow, quote, the Indian state. Remember, that is their end goal at the end of it. In this, it was stated, start in the countryside where your enemy is weak and then encircle and capture cities. Recruit and place Maoist sympathizers in key public and private sectors. Infiltrate enemy camp, quote unquote, in departments like finance, military, power, police, defense. Disrupt activities from within by gaining control of the workers. The broad aim that it talked of was to create groups for, quote, city action teams. Basically, Naxalism is no longer just about wielding the gun. It is very much an intellectual, organized threat in urban areas today. Let me also bring to light some recent cases where so-called activists have been charged under serious sections of the IPC and UAPA for Naxal links and activities. We all know the famous Bhima Koregaon case from January 2018. One person died in violent clashes between two caste groups near Pune. Now, the cops blamed speeches made at this Elgar Parishad organized by Naxal groups for the violence. Remember, 16 people were arrested, charged under IPC and UAPA sections, including famous names like Father Stan Swami, Sudha Bhardwaj, Varavara Rao and others. In April 2013, activists Sheetal Sathe and Sachin Mali were booked under UAPA for funding Naxal activities. In August 2007 in Mumbai, activists Vernon Gonzalez and Sridhar Srinivasan were arrested for possessing explosives, and Gonzalez and Srinivasan were convicted under UAPA, Explosive Substances Act and the IPC. So the big question, the big debate coming up today, with the Prime Minister warning of quote-unquote intellectual Naxals or urban Naxals, however you may want to term it, how prepared is India to deal with this threat? Have we done more than what needed to be done? And have we shrunk this footprint, or has it only expanded, especially in the last 10 years? But first up, listen into what the Prime Minister said in detail.
नक्सलवाद के हर फॉर्म को हमने पराजित करना पड़ेगा जी। बंदूक वाला भी है और कलम वाला भी नक्सलवाद है। हमें इन सब का काट निकालना पड़ेगा जी। हमारी युवा पीढ़ी को भ्रमित करने के लिए ऐसी बचकाना बातें कर करके चल पड़ते हैं लोग, और इतना नुकसान देश को हो रहा है और आने वाले दिनों में कोई संभाल नहीं पाएगा जी। और इसलिए हमने जैसे नक्सल प्रभावित जिलों पर फोकस किया है, उसी प्रकार से उन्होंने अब अपना इंटेलेक्चुअल दायरा उन जगह पे पहुंचाने का प्रयास किया है जो आने वाली पीढ़ियों में विकृत मानसिकता पैदा कर सकते हैं, एक दूसरे के प्रति द्वेष पैदा कर सकते हैं, इमोशनल चीजों को आउट ऑफ प्रोपोर्शन उछाल करके समाज के अनेक टुकड़ों में खाई पैदा कर सकते हैं, बिखराव पैदा कर सकते हैं। देश की एकता और अखंडता, सरदार वल्लभ भाई पटेल हमारी प्रेरणा हो, हमें ऐसी किसी चीजों को देश में चलने नहीं देना है, लेकिन बुद्धिपूर्वक करना पड़ेगा।
I think the Prime Minister, in his statement today, which we played out, has outlined what we're discussing and the threat that he's talking about. So I won't elaborate on it any more than I have in the opening. I want to go across to the guests who are joining us. Tom Varakkan is the BJP spokesperson. We are awaiting a member of the Congress party to be joining us. Abhijit Iyer Mitra is Senior Fellow, Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. Colonel J.K. Singh is Jharkhand Police SP STF and Commandant. Ratan Sharda, RSS researcher and author, and Fuad Halim is CPIM leader, all joining us on the show, and I thank you for your time. I want to begin with a couple of experts on our show first. Colonel G.K. Singh, I'm coming to you. Since you deal with this threat on ground, but you deal with the ones possibly wielding the gun, the Prime Minister today equated the ones wielding the gun, but also talked about and highlighted the threat of those who are not carrying guns, but are, quote-unquote, intellectual Naxals. How serious do you think this threat is, and have we been able to counter this threat?
Well, I personally feel that yes, it is a threat which is increasing day by day, and this needs to be taken very, very seriously. As it has been amply highlighted, that those who are only holding the gun are not Naxals. The idealism needs to be countered by idealism. Any amount of people holding the guns are eliminated. It will not eliminate the idealism. Therefore, we need to identify those areas and then work towards developing an armor idealism. When I say, actually, if you look at this time frame, we are celebrating Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. We are celebrating the way freedom fighting has taken place, and we are seeking a lot of strength. That is one possible armor which can be utilized to ensure that the youth does not become soft target.
Okay.
As far as focusing on this aspect is concerned, I must highlight that there has been a large number of focus areas particularly in this aspect also. While in remote areas, people are also being approached by a certain amount of pamphlets and posters which are highly emotive. We can also think of connecting with the youth with these centers. Basically, these are something akin to overground workers in anti-terrorist areas.
Precisely.
It also includes intelligentsias, the media people, NGOs, some of them who have been harboring such thoughts. And therefore, first thing which is most required is to have a vision as to how we want to go about it. Also, identify these soft targets. The youth definitely is one. The oppressed people are also the other targets who are potential targets.
Right.
Therefore, we need to have a proper framework. We have moved ahead. We are thinking. There are brainstorming sessions which are taking place at many places.
Okay.
Of course, in some other form, this has been tackled. But we need to go about it a little more deliberately, and it needs certain amount of preparation and an outline of vision and a mission mode movement to its full bound execution.
Okay. Even the action that you talked, we've seen recently taking place, Abhijit, the Colonel talked about NGOs, activists, so-called, etc. Generally, they are accused of being, quote-unquote, urban Naxals or intellectual Naxals. And we've seen enough documents come in from such ultra-left, often banned organizations that talk about infiltration into civil society and civil organizations, even very key installments that govern a citizen's life. But generally speaking, also in the public intellectual space, we often hear and speak of them. I want to understand from you, when he talks about, for example, NGOs and activists, etc., we've seen some action take place, especially on NGOs, their foreign fundings, their FCRA, permits, etc. Even activists have gone to jail. The government has faced a lot of criticism over this. That, not often have you been able to prove that there is a tangible evidence against such elements or such individuals. What do you make of this threat that the Prime Minister outlined today? And how well has India done while understanding this threat to counter this threat?
Right. So remember, we will never find tangible evidence of intellectual support for Naxalism. Remember, this is an idea that Mao started off, when he was hiding out in the hills of remote China, being chased by Chiang Kai-shek. He developed this concept in his little red book of that the Maoists should move through a population as a fish does through water. And they must increase the contradictions of purpose of the state. They must do everything to increase the alienation of the state through to the people.
Right.
And he recommended that this be done primarily through false flag attacks, putting on the dresses of the military and the police and killing people so that they would hate the state. And then getting people like artists, intellectuals, film writers, etc., filmmakers, etc., to, propagate the narrative. Now, the issue is you can never actually, if a person, for example, an allegedly famous author called Arundhati Roy calls these people Gandhians with guns. Now, if you have this kind of romanticization of violence happening, it's not on. On the other hand, how do you criminally punish somebody who calls a violent organization like this Gandhians with guns? It's not possible under any rubric of law. And if we go down that path, we do turn ourselves into a police state.
Right.
We need to understand, we keep coming back to this fact. And, the books that you quoted, they're not new. All of this was, written out by Charu Majumdar in his book, Historical Aid Documents, where he wanted to create these contradictions of purpose, where the state turns against its own people. And that is where we have to understand that, the overground activities, there is very little we can do as a liberal democracy. They use our democracy against us.
Right.
They use our freedoms against us.
So what do we do?
They use all of it to engender hatred of the state and to create a situation where you have revolution. What you can, however, do is that when people are found justifying violence, when they are found, justifying it on the basis of poverty, justifying it on the basis saying, this is against landlords, etc., etc.
Or identity.
You need to take severe action against them then and there.
You know, very importantly, the Prime Minister mentioned how such forces, and I'm quoting from his speech, speak the language of law and constitution. They sound innocuous and innocent, and perhaps that encapsulates leftism in total. It sounds like the right thing. It sounds very attractive, especially to the young. And there is a famous saying that by the time you're in your 20s, you're obviously a leftist. By the time you're 40, you would hate the leftists. But I leave that to another day. But he did encapsulate that. And I want to take that to Fuad Halim. I want to bring in his view, possibly a contrarian one, to what our first two guests have said. The Prime Minister mentioned exactly this contradiction, that these so-called intellectual Naxals speak the language of law and constitution. But for Adalim, we've seen in recent times, or even, over the last few decades, most of it transcends into violence. Now, in a democratic, liberal society like India, that Abhijit is mentioning, there can be no place for romanticism of violence. Do you believe we first need to begin with that? All of our contradictions, all of our disagreements aside, but violence cannot be justified.
Well, the first thing is that you mentioned in your comment is that Naxals are in favor of violence and they are in favor of being part of the democratic process. I think so that contradiction you have to resolve amongst yourself, and I think the Prime Minister has to resolve within his own mind as to whether he actually considers Naxalism a strain of thought that is committed to violence or committed to democracy. Because the problem starts from there. Does he not want the Naxals to join the mainstream? Is he categorically
but after
saying
giving
that
up guns, after giving up guns,
finish off, it's very kind of you. I think so. The contradiction lies within you and the Prime Minister. You and the Prime Minister share the same contradiction.
No, first of all, no. I never said that Naxalisms believe in democracy. In fact, I quoted a 2007 document of CPI Maoist banned organization, which talked about overthrowing the Indian state. I never talked about them believing in democracy.
It's very clear that the question of violence, whether it be the RSS variety that Sardar Patel had banned or the Naxal variety that the government has been continuously banning, is something that is not to be tolerated by the state. Now, Sardar Patel was definitely one who banned the RSS, but he did not make any comment on Naxalism. I don't know where our Prime Minister got that idea from. I would like him to quote Sardar Patel's any speech, any document where Sardar Patel has taken a stand against Naxalism. Naxalism was born in the late 60s.
No, Prime Minister did not quote Sardar Patel. Fuad Halim, the Prime Minister did not quote Sardar Patel.
He mentioned Sardar Patel in this context.
No. What I mentioned was his earlier... No, one second, let me clarify this. I mentioned his earlier comment where he said that the Sardar Patel dam was stalled, the construction of it was stalled for several years by these such intellectual Naxals. That's what he had said. He has not quoted Sardar Patel on Naxalism.
I stand corrected. But Sardar Patel did ban the RSS in the same strain of thought for participating in violence and spreading hate. But coming back to the main context here at the moment, you see, the issue that actually breeds violence at all levels, whether it be of the Naxal variety or the non-Naxal variety, is actually born out of economic, what you call, disparities. And unemployment is increasing in India. The Prime Minister is not applying his mind to the concrete conditions which gives rise to organizations that are married to violence. And I think so that is the core crux, that is the problem of our nation and the Prime Minister at this point of time. He wants to distract the attention from his own failures, which is actually creating a huge breeding ground in India for organizations with ultra violent tendencies here. It's not only the Naxals, the other organizations are also growing in leaps and bounds here because of this economic disparity. It preys upon the mind of young people who are unemployed, who are educated, who do not get an opportunity because the state has failed them, and they look
But is violence the answer?
So,
before I take that to the BJP representative, you've dragged in the RSS too, so Ratan Sharda will respond to that. But is violence the answer? I asked you precisely this question. In a liberal democracy, parliamentary democracy, is violence the answer?
Please let me finish.
Yeah, please finish.
Yeah, and here what we find is the Prime Minister actually coming across and saying that the state is going to use violence. This is a veiled way of saying that because I am in power, I am going to use state power. He's addressing the Home Ministry, what is the congregation of Home Ministers and all the police chiefs, and saying that state power, state violence is something that he is going to wield when he is going to sort out a problem in terms of internal security. So he is also speaking the language of violence.
Well, it is said, okay, for Adalim, I have to move on, but it is said that, of course, state needs to have the monopoly on violence. He also, interestingly, in his speech today, talked about how there are law-abiding citizens, there are peace-loving citizens, 99% of them are like that, to protect them and their rights. And the fact that they are following the law, the police and the security systems cannot let the criminal element go away. And I think most people will agree with him, because the state's duty is to protect me from that violence. It is not to protect the perpetrator of the violence. So if it needs to unleash violence for that, so be it. That is how policing is done. I don't know what utopia you're talking about. But let me bring in Tom Vadakan. Arshpreet of the Congress is also joining us. Tom Vadakan, respond to what Fawad Aleem is saying, that this is all of this, you're not talking about the facts on ground or the disenchantment on ground, the economic distress on ground and the unemployment which is creating these tendencies, and you're only wanting to shy away from your own failures.
The honorable comrade from the CPM is forgetting that unemployment has been a phenomenon that has been there and has run parallel to the Naxal movement. It is not something that has happened yesterday. Now let me give him some statistics. The Naxalite activity has declined by 60%. From 22,058 incidents in 2009, we are now at 908, 2017. And now we have only 30 districts which have the footprints of this red brethren that he is talking about. I also want to tell Mr. Halim one more thing. He says the states has now descended into violence. The job of the state and the police is to protect the citizenry, not to give security to the red brethren who want to kill people. And for what? Their idealism. Their idealism is something that is sold by these intellectuals, trying to create a situation to divide India. They have done this in various universities and they continue doing it. They have entered into alliances with different terrorist activities too. I'll tell you something, the same Naxalites were linked up with the LTT when they were active. Arms supply was being done. Extortion is being done. Each Naxalite is being paid a salary. That is how they are shaping up. Okay. And now the Prime Minister and the Home Ministers of all states have joined hands to fight and take them on. I think it is one of the best steps that can be taken.
Okay, since you represent the BJP, Mr. Vadakan, since you represent the BJP and in effect the government, I want to ask you on the intellectual Naxal threat, the urban Naxal threat, as we colloquially call it. Now, you're talking about the shrinking footprint. I mentioned it. The Red Terror footprint is shrinking. The Indian forces have had great successes on that. But what about intellectual Naxalism? Have you done enough on that front?
Well, the investigative agencies are active. They have smoking gun evidence coming on, and there's a lot more to be done because this is a very fishy variety of intellectuals, and they talk something in public and private. They have some different kind of literature which they store in their houses. They distribute. So our intelligence agencies, our technological advantages that we have are being used thoroughly to get to the root of it. Believe me, this activity will be nailed, and it won't be long when our brethren from the CPIM would say, look, this is too much. But the state should not rest till action is taken on these elements who kill people and who are against the democratic roots of India.
Okay. Arshpreet from the Congress Party is joining us. Arshpreet, even the Congress Party, when it was in power in the centre during the UPA years, has talked about the very severe threat of left-wing terrorism. Today, the Prime Minister is talking about urban Naxalism, or, in the past, he has accused Congress of being hijacked by quote-unquote urban Naxals. But he's talking about the fact that the Indian youth is being misled on many issues. Emotive issues are being blown out of proportion, as he said, to mislead the country, to create, for example, agitations, violent agitations. We've got a document of the CPI Maoist, the band outfit, which talks about how they infiltrated farm law agitation. What business do they have? So does the opposition, in other words, the Congress, also not have a responsibility to be careful about who's infiltrating such so-called social agitations?
Well, number one, I think the Bharatiya Janata Party needs to revisit their history, redo their history, because they have clearly distorted it. They should pick up the statement of the erstwhile Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh, and he categorically said, and I quote, that Naxalism is one of the biggest threats to India.
Yes, he did.
External threats.
Yes.
And the Bharatiya Janata Party, they, just like the party, is this nara of theirs that the Naxalism should be done away with. What have you done in the last 8 years? In majority of the states, you have your government, you are in the center, and you want to come here, you want to talk about it. It's big talk and no action at all whatsoever, just like the definition of the Bharatiya Janata Party with regards to this issue as well. You see, there's been 8 years since they have been in power. Have they been able to root it out? Have they been able to diminish it? Instead, it was the Congress party that made it possible for it to be diminished and mitigated. It is the Bharatiya Janata Party, ever since they came, it's been on the rise. And number two, the Bharatiya Janata Party would only get the time to act if they have time from elections. All the time, they're on election mode, campaign mode, especially Mr. Modi. And when they're not contesting elections, they are on Operation Lotus mode.
Okay.
So,
can I not deviate from that subject today, because this is a very pinpointed subject? But Ashmit, I wanted to ask you, the threat he talked of intellectual Naxalism, are you on the same page with the Prime Minister? That there is a threat of intellectual Naxalism and we must protect our youth from it.
Since you said, you quoted a very good statement that let's not deviate. The Bharatiya Janata Party has been deviating for the last 8 years. Where is action is what we say. You have a problem with it, great, root it out. You should diminish it. You should do something about it, but you only come and talk about it in meetings. That is all that they do. And second of all, the blame game. If it helps root it out, please do that. But if it is not, please understand that you are in the government, you are in majority of the states, so start acting.
As far as the footprint of red terror is concerned, there are enough statistics to say that footprint has shrunk. I want your particular comment on quote-unquote intellectual Naxalism. When the government takes actions, for example, against certain activists or certain NGOs, quote-unquote, the Congress party criticizes it. Are you for that action or are you not for that action?
See, number one, we are for the action, but the fact of the matter is that the Bharatiya Janata Party has been unnecessarily misquoting. They should define what Naxalism is for them, because they probably have some different definition of Naxalism and Naxalites. Whoever they want to nab under strict laws, they would just call him a Naxalite. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a reason as to why we have a proper procedure, due process of law, we have courts. So they should first tell us if they even understand the definition of Naxalism.
Well, in such cases where there have been activists who've been accused and have been applied sections against, obviously those processes are going through courts and there's absolutely no way or no reason why that should be bypassed. Ratan Sharda, I want to come to you. You can respond to Fuad Aleem, who equated red terror or Naxalism to terror that emanates from right-wing ideology. He talked about the RSS. And your thoughts overall on whether India has done enough on the threat that the Prime Minister is talking about, because there are several people who accuse the BJP government, despite its strength and majorities, of actually being too soft on this threat.
Well, Shivani, thanks. First of all, I just want to dispose of a little bit of points that Congress person raised. He talked on Manmohan Singh, but he forgets that his successor, Mrs. Rahul Gandhi, stood up with the crowds in JNU, which were shouting, Shabzalam Sharminda hai, Tere Kate Zinda hai, who shouted, Desh ke tukde honge, Inshallah, Inshallah. So they have lost way, because Indira Gandhi was totally against this. Entire Congress has been totally against violence against democracy. In fact, Manmohan Singh, I may remind him, clearly talked about Kundakulam, which was led by the urban Naxals and the church clerics. It was clearly pointed out by Manmohan Singh himself. Similarly, we see Sterlite, how a very important plant, which was 40% giving 40% of copper to India, has been shut down. All due to these anti-development people, all due to this people who are actually playing in the hands of left. Now coming to the CPM, see, first of all, I didn't want to bring up the point because I wanted to spare their past. but now she has brought in RSS. Of course, RSS is banned. The ban was lifted without any conditions, and there was no charge against it, which was proven. So that simply clears that point. Now, my point is that communist movement is basically a communist parivar, Marxist parivar. You should not differentiate between the overground parties like Communist Party of India or Communist Party Marxist and Naxal movements and urban Naxals. They belong to the same family. For example, 1947 to 1951, there was an armed rebellion by Communist Party which focused on Andhra Pradesh, which is still the base of Naxals even now, because it was created way back in 40s and 51. Only after they were crushed, they joined the parliamentary system. Then, if people won't remember that they tried to create trade unions within army, and their top leaders were arrested during 1962 war with China, and they supported China. So, as far as their ideological inclination is concerned, he's talking of state oppression, armed oppression of the oppressed. Does he remember what China does to people? Does he remember North Korea does to people? Have they ever spoken against them? Now, coming to more serious issue, what is an urban Naxal? People who were arrested in the Bhima Koregaon case. Bhima Koregaon is a 100-year-old story. But why did it suddenly become violent? Why it suddenly became a huge movement? Because urban Naxals joined them. They created an atmosphere where this will take a totally different direction. You remember Delhi Fort, they supported the 26 January violence. They created a furor around farmer protests, you already know, in CA. So where there is a fault line, they will support the people, so fault lines become larger. And what are the fault lines? You look at the triple talaq, they said, let us go by the Sharia. They supported every regressive step because somehow they believe that creating division in the society is very important.
Okay,
I will go a step further. Just a moment, very important point. Shivani, just a moment. If you think that they are any different, remember the call to disunite families, create disaffection in the married life by talking of patriarchy of husband-wife relationship, of misogyny of husband-wife relationship, of talking about families, how they are oppressive, how society is oppressive. Everywhere they are trying to disrupt the social structure, social fabric, because that can help bring anarchy. That is how it can then create anarchy which can be suitable for communist revolution. In USA itself, Democratic Party has been hijacked by the New Left. And you know this lady who actually left Democratic Party, realizing it has been taken over. Yeah, it has been taken over by the extreme left. This is how they want to plan in India also. Okay. And unless we recognize this, intellectual warfare is not looking at their papers. I'm sorry, Mr. Badakkan. It lies in fighting with them ideologically, intellectually, challenging them intellectually.
Okay, can I take final comments from Colonel J.K. Singh also and Abhijit Iyer Mitra? Mr. Singh, one more time. While we may be able to tackle the gun-wielding Naxal, as we're all discussing, the threat now, in especially the new age of social media, information and technology, is the pen-wielding Naxal, as the Prime Minister talked about. What would you like to see happen, if you could very quickly entail for us? In the next few years, if we have to tackle this threat, the Prime Minister certainly talked about the role of technology today.
I shall quickly talk about some of the possible solutions. Firstly, we need to turn this hatred into love, into camaraderie, into feeling for one citizen towards another. How do we do it? They attack on issues like casteism, issues like the issues which have been just mentioned by my fellow speakers. We need to ensure that they feel little more proud of being Indian citizen. And they will feel it if we seek strength from history, if we seek strength from freedom fighting, if we seek strength from modern development which has taken place. There are many personalities who have gone abroad. They have done well. There are many people who, despite resources, have risen high. So we need to turn hate into love. The second aspect is awareness. Remember that earlier, people who were the subject or the target of actual gun violent Naxalism, they are aware. Now they don't want to hold guns. They want to hold computers.
Right.
So education and awareness can have great impact as far as reducing the impact of urban Naxalism is concerned.
That brings me to my final point. I'll take that to Abhijit Iyer Mitra, because, actually it is campus fronts or campuses, university campuses, And as Mr. Ratan Sharda quite rightly pointed out, political ultra-leftism growing. And some have accused even Indian opposition of, moving from centrism to ultra-leftism. Now, that's the threat that is emerging. And it is amongst the educated, amongst the middle class, amongst the upwardly mobile. What do you think the Indian government then needs to do to counter this threat that the Prime Minister is talking about?
Well, Shivani, look, the really easy answer to this, but the most difficult to do, is to, de-radicalize education. Remember, this kind of mentality has been ingrained into the system. When, the Congress introduced this notion of a committed bureaucracy, which had to be roughly committed to the Congress point of view, the more left the Congress goes, the more left this committed bureaucracy's ideology goes. There is a complete institutional capture by the left of all academic positions in the humanities and things like that. And that, unfortunately, really needs to be cleared. Now, we've seen this exact kind of obfuscatory justification exactly on this program. See, poverty does lead to violence, but it leads to societal violence. It does not lead to organized violence directed specifically against the state with a very specific purpose. Right? Who does that organization? Who coalesces all the gripes into one and directs it against the state? Against one particular political party, against so-called class enemies. Do you think people who do not have the ability to go to a school to learn ABC suddenly learn dictatorship of the proletariat and all this communist mumbo-jumbo out of the sky? They are clearly being indoctrinated from somewhere. So, who is targeting, who is directing and organizing all of this into one? And that is your so-called intellectual class. You need a defunding and a deplatforming of that intellectual class.
Okay.
They unfortunately do have an institutional capture that needs to be reversed. It's easier said than done.
It is easier said than done. It is the age-old question that is possibly being discussed not just in India, even in developed societies and communities today. But I've run out of time. I do thank all of our guests for joining us and sharing their views. I'll move on to the other big story that we've been